Fashion's Best Games Rant. Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil 4, directed by Shinji Mikami, who, of course, directed the original Resident Evil, directed Resident Evil on GameCube, the remake, of course, what I'm referring to, and would go on to direct Vanquish, which, of course, I talked about in my last vid. Resident Evil 4 is, I mean, what more can anybody say about that game that hasn't been said a million times? But it's basically just a 20-hour marathon of unforgettable set pieces, boss encounters, and environments. Unforgettable moments. I freaking love that game. But what's funny about it, and what might shock all of you, is that looking back on it, when that game was first released, I did not feel quite the same way that I do now in retrospect. I remember being very conflicted when it was first released because it was such a huge shift in priorities from the original games. You know, the original games are all about slow, creepy, chilling exploration. It was definitely not, they were not action games. The combat was, you know, something you wanted to avoid as much as possible. So Resident Evil 4 kind of flipped the series inside out. And I remember being slightly bummed by that. I remember being conflicted because on one hand it was like, well, I'm having fun. This game plays extremely well. It looks amazing and all this other stuff. But I remember thinking like, but this isn't Resident Evil. What did they do to Resident Evil? What did they do to my Resident Evil? And, you know, I think it's one of those cases where over time I've just appreciated it more and more and more every time I've played it. You know, and at this point, I mean, it's been several years. The game's old as fuck. Still plays well. Still looks great. And it's been released several times. And now I think it's one of the best action games ever made. I think it's definitely the most fun game in the series to play. Even like the recent Resident Evil 2 remake. I mean, it's a great return to that classic Resident Evil style. It's definitely a great horror game. But that's just it. I mean, it's a totally different beast. I never regarded Resident Evil 4 as that much of a horror game, per se. Like, it's definitely horror-themed. There are things that are disturbing. It's obviously... it's got that macabre atmosphere, you know. The monsters are disturbing and intimidating and awesomely designed. And there are times where the game is very intense. Like, the scariest moments in Resident Evil 4 are when you encounter a new enemy. You know, you're playing the game for the first time, you encounter new enemies that you don't know how to handle yet, and they're intimidating as fuck, and they transform, or they're growing appendages and claws, or who knows what, and you're just like, what the fuck do I do with this thing? You know, those moments are white-knuckle and intense, and the first time playing Resident Evil 4, I remember those are the moments that stuck with me as, like, scary. When you first encounter that one xenomorph-looking thing in the water tunnels, or the weird regenerator monsters at the end of the game. Like, that stuff, the first time you come across it, is scary in a run-for-your-life sort of way. But most of the game is, it does sort of have this Evil Dead sort of feel to it, where it's just like balls-to-the-walls action. So I still kind of look at it more as an action game first and a horror game second. I don't think it's that scary. When I think of scary games, I think of like Fatal Frame 2, Silent Hill 1, 2, and 3, or any of the old classic Resident Evil games where you were more vulnerable, had to conserve your ammo, and all this other stuff. Resident Evil 4 does none of that for me. It doesn't really... It's not a game I, you know, come back to when I want those goosebumps, when I want those chills. And, you know, fear being the subjective thing that it is, I'm sure there are people that to this day think that, you know, even that opening village section is like the scariest thing ever. And to me, it's just like, nah, I'm a one-man army. Leon Kennedy in that game just has like a fucking briefcase full of weapons, and it's like you constantly feel like you have enough options at any given time to survive, to make it through any given part of that game. That's not to say that it's like a walk in the park or that it's just a shoot 'em up. There's definitely a nice balance of suspense and empowerment there are times where you definitely feel like you're just low enough on ammo, especially in the late game, or you're down to maybe just a couple of grenades or something. But even then, like, it's definitely more white knuckle action than, like, chilling suspense and not wanting to turn a corner. So for me, I think Resident Evil 4, what made me finally warm up to it, like, I want to say, just a few years after it came out, I think there was just a period of time where I was disappointed that it wasn't like, my classic old school scary Resident Evil. But over the years, I think, and this is pretty much what everybody feels, is that it's one of the best action games ever made. I mean, it's a stellar experience. I can't think of any other action games like this that manage to sustain the experience for 20 hours long. I think of games like Dead Space that really fail to do that. It's another horror action game that's like 20 hours long, and every single hour of that game just feels like it's repeating itself and recycling the same shit over and over. Resident Evil 4 never does that. Like, every moment of that game is memorable and unique and awesome. Even the story and the characters are kind of fun and campy and kind of embrace the Hollywood action tone that game is going for. More so than most Resident Evil games, where things are a little more dour and try to be grounded. Resident Evil 4 just completely embraces how ridiculous, the overall premise of Resident Evil has always been, and that just adds to the fun to me. Plus, the QTEs, the QuickTime button prompts, all that stuff has, to this day, I don't think any other video games I've played have ever used that stuff as well, even though Resident Evil 4 introduced those mechanics. I think about the knife fight with Krauser as probably one of the best interactive cutscenes in gaming history. I would put that up there as one of the best choreographed interactive cutscenes in gaming. Like, the whole thing is just quick button prompts, QTEs, but it's so well paced and so well set up that I always look forward to that fight, just because it's as awesome to watch as it is to hit those buttons when you need to have Leon dodging the knife and all that other stuff. But anyway, yeah, Resident Evil 4 is amazing. Kind of a shame that most of its sequels, especially like RE5 and 6, to me were a huge step down from what that game accomplished. But, Resident Evil 2 Remake, I mean, it's great, but I think Capcom has yet to top Resident Evil 4 just as an action game, as an action experience. That is a one-of-a-kind thing. And, yeah, it's amazing. On to the next video. Ciao.